What is up, guys? Welcome back to Hail Joey Noter, back with another video, and today we will be talking about the top 10 most underrated players in the entire NBA. 2 days ago we did the top 10 most overrated players. Today we're doing the top 10 most underrated players. Let's not waste any more time, let's get right into it. The first player, I'm going with Jaren Jackson Jr. from the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, Jaren Jackson Jr. is one of those players that I just feel gets forgotten about a lot. He's one of those big men that can do it all. He's a really good defender, can shoot the ball, is really mobile, and I think he just gets underappreciated. I mean, if you look at the regular season, the Memphis Grizzlies were like the 8th seed because of Jaren Jackson and Ja Morant. And all of it really went to Ja Morant, people were talking about, but no one was giving any credit to Jaren Jackson Jr. When Jaren Jackson Jr. went down with an injury in the bubble, the Grizzlies struggled, and they ended up not making the playoffs, and I think that played a big role. I think the Blazers were better than them, but I think if they had Jaren Jackson Jr., I think they would have had a better chance of beating the Blazers, and maybe even making it into the playoffs. So for those reasons, Jaren Jackson Jr. for me is my first underrated player. With my next guy, I'm going from another guy from the same draft, Deandre Ayton. Now, it's weird to say a first overall pick could be underrated, but it really just comes to the fact that the guys drafted after him. Luka Doncic and Trae Young, two of the top 2 players in the NBA, were drafted after DeAndre Ayton, so he gets kind of forgotten about when you talk about that rookie class. But DeAndre Ayton has had a very good career so far. I expect big things from him playing with Chris Paul this season, and I think DeAndre Ayton has been very slept on in his career. I mean, the guy was still the first overall pick, and he's not a bust, and he's not even close to being it. He's living up to, in my opinion, his potential, and I think he's going to have a huge season. So for that reason, DeAndre Ayton is very underrated for me. Next guy, we're going with a really controversial choice, guys. Paul George. Now, Paul George, he's one of those guys you're going to see on a lot of overrated lists. He's going to be one of those players that are on a lot of the lists for not very good seasons last year. But in my opinion, Paul George is highly underrated. I mean, this guy is extremely skilled. He's one of the most athletic players in the NBA. He's a very smart player. He can hit shots when it matters. He's a good defender. And I know he had a really bad playoffs, a really bad bubble, but we can't just take everything away from this guy that he's accomplished. I mean, he was injured a lot in the regular season, and people don't talk about that. He wasn't able to build a chemistry with those guys on the team. I know what he's been talking about, he's made a lot of excuses, but I think his basketball skills speak for themselves. He's a very good player. 2 years ago, he was in MVP conversations. I think we need to start talking about Paul George being like a player that's very underrated. Just because you don't like him does not mean he's bad, and I think that happens a lot with Paul George. So for those reasons, Paul George is highly underrated. We're going with another controversial choice for the next one. We're going with Draymond Green, the most hated man in the entire NBA. I mean, he's up there. Draymond Green, for me, is very underrated. This might be my bias kicking in because I am a Warriors fan, but I find him being completely disrespected for his championship DNA, his defensive ability, his just ability to make smart plays in the clutch time, and I think people just completely write him off for that because he's very annoying to other teams. And I think people think like they caught Draymond Green or something this season where it was like, oh, haha, we caught you. You're only good with Steph Curry and Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant. But in reality, we know that. What Draymond Green is, he's a spark, he's a team leader, he's a very good defender, he's a smart playmaker and a smart passer, and the guy overall can hit a shot when it matters. I know his threes percentage has gone down drastically, but in the fourth quarter, when we give him the ball for an open 3, most of the time he makes it. I think people didn't watch Draymond Green last year. He missed a lot of games with injuries, and people need to realize he was playing with G League players, and that's something that gets completely swept under the rug. I always compare it to like a Dennis Rodman situation. If Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen got injured for that Bulls team, and everyone expected Dennis Rodman to be the best player on the team, the Bulls wouldn't have been good. Dennis Rodman wouldn't have looked as good. And that's okay. Dennis Rodman isn't the best player on the team. Same with Draymond Green. So for those reasons, Draymond Green's underrated. Next player, we're going to go with Gordon Hayward, a guy who got a huge contract this offseason, and a lot of people are absolutely clowning the Hornets. Gordon Hayward's one of those players that people don't understand his ability to just affect the game. The dude's a pretty good defender. He shoots the ball very efficiently and very well. He has a nice mid-range game. He's sneaky athletic. And he's just an overall smart player that people don't talk about. I think the Boston Celtics really did lose a lot by losing Gordon Hayward. They missed their veteran guy who would come in, give them at least a solid 16 points, even more than that. I know he struggled with injuries, but I think on the Charlotte Hornets, this guy's going to have a really good season, especially playing with a really good playmaker like LaMelo Ball. He's going to have a lot of young guys who can run the floor with him. And I just think Gordon Hayward overall is a very underrated player. For those reasons, I think he has to be on this list. Next player, we're going with another very underrated guy. Another guy that's very hated in the NBA. He has his supporters, he has his haters. It's Russell Westbrook. Russell Westbrook's one of those players that he works so hard and people just completely write him off because they don't like him. It's another situation. Just because you don't like the guy does not make him bad, does not make him overrated, and does not make him not a good player. And I think people do that with Paul George, Russell Westbrook, and Draymond Green. Russell Westbrook is very good. In my opinion, he's still the third best point guard in the entire NBA. I think putting players like Chris Paul over him, Kyrie Irving, Kemba Walker, Trae Young, Ben Simmons, I think that's very disrespectful to a guy like Russell Westbrook. Russell Westbrook had a very good season last year. His points did go down, but that's because he was playing with James Harden. When they got rid of Clint Capella, Russell Westbrook had one of the best statistical seasons he's ever had. Russell Westbrook's one of the best point guards in the NBA. He brings intensity, he brings athleticism, and I expect this Wizards team to make the playoffs, and I expect them to be a threat. I don't think anyone wants to see Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal in the playoffs. I think Westbrook's underrated. Next player, I'm going with a guy named Jusuf Nurkic from the Portland Trail Blazers. He's their starting center, and I think people completely underrate him. The Blazers last year lost Jusuf Nurkic with a leg injury, and that absolutely, in my opinion, killed their season. Now, they still were able to get back into the playoffs, but Jusuf Nurkic, in my opinion, is the backbone of that Blazers team. The guy is a very good scoring center. He's a good playmaker. He's a solid defender. And he's just one of those centers that is a do-it-all center. I always compare him to like a Vucevic, Jokic. Obviously, he's very smaller, not smaller, but skill-wise, his skill set's very smaller than them. And he's not as good as those players. But Jusuf Nurkic is like one of those players who's a do-it-all center. I think people don't talk about how big of a loss he was for the Blazers last season. I hope he can play this entire season with no injuries, get back to the playoffs, because this Blazers team's really nice. So I think Jusuf Nurkic is highly underrated. With my next player, I'm going to go with the starting point guard for the Indiana Pacers, Malcolm Brogdon. Malcolm Brogdon's another one of those players that's just very underrated. He's a do-it-all point guard. He's a very good defender, very good playmaker, and can score the ball very efficiently and very well. I think his season was very much underrated. He had a very good season. Him, Domantas Sabonis, and Miles Turner pretty much played without Victor Oladipo for most of the season. And when they did play with Victor Oladipo wasn't very good. So that they pretty much led that team to a high playoff spot, and no one really talked about it. I think Malcolm Brogdon, in my opinion, is a top 3 player on that team right now. I think TJ Warren's bubble completely undermined Malcolm Brogdon's regular season. I think he's one of the best point guards in the NBA, and I think he's a very underrated point guard. For those reasons, Malcolm Brogdon's underrated. For my next player, I'm going with Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart's a guy who was on my list last year, and I think this dude no one talks about. He's such a good defender. He hit a lot of big shots in the Celtics series in the playoffs. Marcus Smart's the backbone of that Celtics team. He brings the heart, he brings the defense, he brings the shooting, he brings a little bit of playmaking. Marcus Smart is the prototypical shooting guard that every NBA team would love. Every NBA team would love Marcus Smart. This guy's amazing. He gets under players' skins. That's his job. Malcolm Brogdon's another one of those players I throw in the Patrick Beverley, Draymond Green situation where his job is to get under people's skin. His job is to hound you on defense. But Marcus Smart might be even higher than Draymond Green and Patrick Beverley at this very moment. That's how good he is. I think people highly underrate him, and if I'm the Celtics, I am not trading that man. So, for those reasons, Marcus Smart's on my list. With my next guy, I'm going with Terry Rozier, another point guard, another guy on the Charlotte Hornets. This guy's very underrated. He got that big contract last offseason, and everyone is talking about how bad of an overpay that was. And then this regular season, everyone was talking about Devontae Graham's breakout year and how he's the best point guard on the team, he's the future of the Hornets, and how he's the guy who was the best player on the team last year. In reality, Terry Rozier was better than Devontae Graham last season. And for me, it's not even a conversation. Terry Rozier is one of those players, another like a Malcolm Brogdon, where he does a little bit of everything. His jump shooting is not amazing, but he can knock it down. His defense is really good. His playmaking is really good. I would love him on a team like the Clippers. Terry Rozier had a better season than Devontae Graham based on his defensive ability. I think efficiency-wise, he absolutely blew Devontae Graham out the water. Points-wise, they were like 0.5 points off. Devontae Graham had him, but the efficiency for me matters. Terry Rozier was the better point guard than Devontae Graham last year, and I think people need to start talking about Terry Rozier as being the best point guard on that team. Obviously not now because of LaMelo Ball, but I mean, we'll see. If LaMelo Ball is not that good, Terry Rozier, I think, needs to be in conversations for being the best guy on that team. Him and Gordon Hayward, I expect him to come off the bench next year, him and Terry Rozier, so hopefully he can do good. That's my top 10 underrated player, guys. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.